requires insurance companies to cover abortions. The Thomas More Society filed the lawsuit in federal court, claiming that law passed in 2019 violates the First Amendment, as well as federal statutes that prevent states from discriminating against health care providers who don't provide abortions. The group filed a similar challenge to the law in state court 4 years ago. A judge ruled against them in that case earlier this year. The state's attorney general has already reaffirmed his commitment to protecting that law. The state Supreme Court has overturned actor Jussie